Okay, welcome everybody to Nixon, Resignation, Reconsidered. I'm so glad that all of you have joined. Again, John will be presenting, and he definitely makes you think when you actually attend one of his classes. Again, keep your mics muted unless you want to talk, but do remember to unmute yourself because we will have background noise going on, and we don't want to interrupt John unnecessarily. I will be recording this, as you know, and we'll be uploading it to YouTube. It will be a private link that we will send out to everybody. You need to watch these videos within a matter of a couple of weeks because we will be deleting them. But we will keep maybe two of them going at a time. But we do want to remind you to watch them in a timely manner. If you need anything, just let us know. And I am stepping away today. So John, hopefully everything will be okay.
Yeah, well, thank you very much.
I have faith in you. Yes. All right. John Powers has taught for several universities and colleges in lifelong learning programs since 2013. By profession, he is currently a director of narrative and documentary films. He began his career as a screenwriter. Later, he turned to performing arts as a producer and presenter of live cultural events. Recently, he returned to filmmaking. He has published several fiction and nonfiction books. He is a graduate of the University of Southern California with an MFA and BFA in drama. And we are so glad that you are going to be sharing your take on Nixon's resignation.
Sandra,
So
thank you. Thank you very much.
enjoy, everyone.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sandra. I appreciate your introduction and presenting this course. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here once again. And we'll discover as we go through this, my background in drama and filmmaking will certainly come into play. I don't want to give a spoiler right now, but you'll begin to notice, particularly in episode 2, how many of the analogies I make to the characters and what they're doing is very much like film making. But there we go. Before we begin, does anyone have anything that they want to say or add before we start down our journey down the river? Oh, boy. Oh, that was good.
I'm quacking.
Okay, that's good. All right, and we'll go about halfway. You could, first of all, as you know, you can interrupt at any point with me. We have a small group here. I can roll with it, answer a question. I don't want you hanging on to something that you feel that's urgent. I can address it. I'll roll with it. But about midway through, I will stop and take a few minutes if you need to go away. And I'll stay on hand to answer questions, and then we'll complete the rest of this first episode. Okay, so let's go. Let me come down and share my screen here. And I'm presuming you can all see this now. Let me go up and get it in full. And what I discovered, I'll say this at the beginning, I thought, oh, I could cover this in 4 episodes. Boy, was I wrong. So there's going to be a part 1, and in the fall, I will be doing a part 2. Part 1 is going to take us up right to the aftermath of the second break-in at the Democratic National Committee in June. And then part 2 will really look at everything that happened after that, leading up to the events in August of 1974 with the resignation. And, I had kind of I guess I'll use this term, kind of a banal title when I first was thinking of this course, Nixon Resignation Reconsidered. If you had asked me 9 months ago what the Watergate story was, I would have been able to give you a brief summary, really in about a minute, and I'll delineate that. But once I got into this story, it really opened up in whole new directions, which I'll be presenting to you. And really, what you see in front of you here is really the subtitle for the course. It is The Silent Coup Against Richard Nixon. And I know that's an intriguing title, and I hope that I live up to it. But you tell me. part one, and today was episode one. And you know, I like to draw my episodes from film titles or versions of film titles. So here is Spies Like Us. Here we go. Well, let me give just a sense right here is what is this whole journey that we're on? What is it about? And I think it's about memory or the lack thereof. We're approaching 50th anniversary of the president's resignation from office. It'll be August of this year. But who among us doesn't know the official story? I will refer to it here. There was a break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters, the Watergate building. The members were caught. Nixon tried to cover up White House complicity. He was undone by his private conversations on tape, and he resigned. That's it. And that's how it's considered today. How would you feel, as I did, that the major elements of this story are wrong? And how would you feel, as I did, that the facts of the story have been available for decades and didn't know about them? And I'm presuming that each of you have the syllabus and source material that I had sent last week. If not, I will resend it. But in those source materials, there's 3 books. The first 2 are really crucial. The one by Jim Hogan, Secret Agenda, which is 40 years old. And then Silent Coup by Lynn Kolodny and Robert Gitman is 30 years old. And all of this material that I'm presenting to you is largely drawn from those 2 works. And all of it is substantiated in these works. So if what I'm presenting through this course intrigues you, I really encourage you to pick those books up. You'll find them on Amazon. You'll find, old editions of them available on Amazon. And they're just an amazing experience. And what's astonishing to me is that other scholars, other journalists, other media people, academics, certainly politicians, aren't referencing this material to understand Watergate. And Watergate's a bigger story than just the break-in of the DNC. But we use that term to really encompass events really going from about 1968 until 1974. And this information, as I said, has been available for decades and didn't know about them. Our journey will discover the facts and the realization that the system did not work. I live out here in Southern California where the Nixon library is at. I've been to it several times. And in fact, for another local school out here, I have done excursions out to it. And they have a wonderful Watergate exhibit. In fact, the whole museum, I like going to the museum a lot because it's well presented. It's been around, for 40 years. So they've gotten rid of a lot of the nonsense and they tell a pretty effective story. But when you get into the Watergate exhibit, they all end up with this last didactic panel saying, yes, the system worked. And what I will be presenting to you is, no, the system didn't work. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here. But I love this image here. Here it is. This looks like a barren Christmas tree out there in the mall. And that's kind of what it's like. The emperor has no clothes, okay? The Christmas tree has no ornaments. And what do I mean is that the legal process involved with Watergate violated some of the basic tenets of our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And of course, it begs the question, well, why? Well, very simply because, and we'll get more into this in the part 2 of this course in the fall. It's simply because people within the system were partisan and deeply flawed, not unlike the world in which we're living today. It's nothing new. These people, back in the 70s, drove an elected leader out of office because they hated him and because he was driving toward a foreign policies that threatened their self-interest. This is so key. You'll recall from our most recent course on Kennedy assassination, he was eliminated for similar reasons in a bloody coup d'etat. President Richard Nixon was eliminated in a bloodless coup d'etat, but it was a coup d'etat nonetheless. In contrast to the official story that cast blame on Nixon, Mitchell, Haldeman, and Ehrlichman, and others, this course will fix blame where the facts point. Now, I don't want you to think that Nixon and the others are blameless, but as you will see in part one here, where blame actually resides. And here it is. John Dean, baby. And, surprise, surprise, Alexander Haig. And I got one more for you. Bob Woodward. Now, we're going to get more into Haig and Woodward in part two of this course, but I want to let you know that's where this journey is going to take us. Okay. This is where the journey will begin today. Moore Radford. And as I like to say, it's spying on the White House. And here comes the question to each of you. Have you ever heard of Moore Radford? It's known as the Moore Radford scandal. And I'm going to presume not, because that's just how it's supposed to be. We weren't supposed to know about it. Here's what it is. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, but primarily the Navy, were carrying out a spy operation against President Nixon and the new National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger. And this spy operation was conducted for 16 months, from September 70 through December of 71. This spy operation was conducted during a time of war, which, I mean, it's always treason, but this is a hanging crime during a time of war. But because it was initiated because the JCS didn't know what the president was doing. That's because the president didn't want them to know what he was doing. He was carrying out major foreign policy initiatives that were about to change the game. Now, I have to tell you, I love this image here of Nixon bowling. And this is not a comical image, even though there is, for us, comic elements within it. But this is exactly how Nixon would relax at night. He'd be over in the executive office building, you know, across the street from the White House, in his office over there working late. And then he would have dinner, usually alone. And then he'd go up to the bowling alley in the executive office, and he'd play by himself for a couple of hours to relax. And around 10, 11 o'clock, he'd go to bed. That's how our president unwound. President Nixon was conducting talks with representatives of both North and South Vietnam at this time to reduce U.S. combat troop involvement in Southeast Asia. Of course, this was in the face of stepped-up bombing campaigns in Laos and Cambodia that weren't divulged to the American people. Remember, Nixon was elected saying, I have a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. Now, his secret plan, he didn't have a plan at all. He was just going to carry out the bombing campaign that LBJ had been conducting for the past 4 or 5 years. But he was going to reduce American involvement by stepping up Vietnamese involvement while carrying out an American air campaign over the sanctuaries and the supply routes going to Laos and Cambodia. Of course, this is a violation of international law, but hey, if nobody knows about it, president was also holding talks at this time with the Soviet Union, and we will come to know this as a policy of détente. He was really working to reduce tensions between the two superpowers by reducing nuclear weapons. Something Kennedy was trying to do. And here was the big one. Nixon was employing back-channel communications with China through Pakistan, and that's important, to establish a new relationship with the mainland government. Because you'll remember, ever since 1949, mainland China didn't exist. We just focused on the former island colony of Formosa and renamed Taiwan with the immigration of so many people from the mainland with the collapse of the Kuomintang government. Well, these three initiatives, opening up talks with Vietnamese, talks with the Soviet Union, and talks with the People's Republic of China, were aimed at, and this is key, ending the Cold War. Not winning, but ending the Cold War. That's what got JFK's head blown apart 10 years before. They were aimed at establishing normal relations between adversaries. And for that reason, in the minds of many, particularly the military, he had to be eliminated. They viewed Nixon and his cohort here, Henry Kissinger's, as traitors. And I'm not kidding when I use that word. That is exactly what they thought of the president at this time, because he came into office with this fully formed foreign policy, but he knew he couldn't carry it out above board through the regular channels of the Defense Department and the State Department. He had to go through another channel to see these things through. The military-industrial complex, as we know, is dependent on a state of war. They're dependent on congressional appropriations and corporate profits. And if Nixon is going to be ending a state of war, there goes all that profit. So let's back up a little bit. How did this spy operation begin? Right here, Navy yeoman Charles Edward Radford. And if they ever make the move, or if they made the movie back in the 70s, I say they should have cast Dennis Weaver. You know, we know him as Chester on Gunsmoke, and that other McLeod. I think he played McLeod. He'd make a great Charles Edward Radford. You know, a real likable guy that nobody could ever think a bad thing about. Radford enlisted in the Navy in '63, and after 4 years in regular service, he was sent to Naval Intelligence School. And he finished near the top of his class, and from there he was posted to the Defense Attaché's office in the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi. There's a shot of the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi. Doesn't that look great? It looks like it belongs on a college campus. That looks like the student union. It also tells us just how open U.S. embassies were long ago. They're not like that. They're all built like fortresses today. Anyway, after 3 years, when the assignment to India ended, Radford sought the job of admiral's writer, a post that involved clerical work, dictation, memo writing, and it would make him a personal aide to a flag officer. And this was the route that Radford thought would help earn an officer's commission. And what he was really looking for is to move up into a chief petty officer rank. By the summer of '70, a prestigious and highly sensitive assignment linking the Pentagon and the White House opened up, and Radford became a leading candidate. I dare say the leading candidate. He was chosen, and he arrived in D.C. in September of 1970. And he went to work in an office that directly served the nation's most senior military man. Admiral Thomas Moore, who at that time was serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. There, as you see, the admiral there with President Nixon. Radford became the personal aide to this gentleman we see here, Rear Admiral Rembrandt Robinson, who was top assistant to Moore. Now, I have to enjoy, this is a wonderful photograph here of Admiral Robinson. You know, he's in his whites right there. And it's like, you know, you're not really an admiral unless you're also being, you know, with a sea command, unless you have a pair of binoculars. You know, when you see a lot of photographs of admirals, they're always photographed with binoculars. It's kind of like putting a doctor with a stethoscope. Now he's official. Anyway, this team of Robinson and Radford were a two-man team that ran the Joint Chiefs of Staff Liaison Office to the National Security Council. And this is what's key right there, the National Security Council. I'll go on about that in just a moment. Now, their assignment didn't amount to much on an organizational chart, but it connected them on one side to the highest reaches of the military, and on the other side, it put him right inside the White House and right alongside the powerful National Security Council advisor, Henry Kissinger. Though small in size, under Kissinger, the NSC wielded far more power than the bureaucracies of the Departments of Defense and State, because that's how Nixon wanted it. Now, let me back up just a little bit. I'll go off on a wild card here a little bit. The National Security Council was created with the National Security Act in 1947. Not much was done with it. Along with that, CIA and a number of other agencies were created. Not much was done with it at first, but when Eisenhower administration came in 53, it really took off. And it took off because Eisenhower had his vice president sit in for him at the NSC. Eisenhower, as you may recall, he had a number of medical issues during those years then, and he also, frankly, he preferred being out on the course, playing more on a goal. Yeah. So Nixon would sit in on these NSC meetings, and he truly began to understand this could be a power base within the executive branch of the government because it didn't need congressional approval. It could do what it wanted, and nobody could see what they were doing. When Nixon did not win in '60 election, Kennedy came into office. Kennedy didn't understand. He attended and went to the NSC, but he didn't use the NSC as it had been done during the Eisenhower administration. Johnson was the same way. So when Nixon comes into office in '69 under his own right, he supercharges this small group of people known as the NSC. Now, the JCS has a liaison team to keep the NSC staff informed, and that's where these guys come in. They were serving as Moore's eyes and ears to the National Security Council. And Robinson, seen right here with his binoculars, stressed to his yeoman that loyalty to Moore stood above all else. Isn't that something? This is what rules. Radford understood that his main job was to assist Robinson by ensuring that everything seen and heard inside the White House was passed on to Moore. There's Admiral Moore right there. He's now serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the most powerful person, not just in the Navy, but in the military. In the fall of 1970, when Radford took up his post, this was a pivotal time for the JCS because from their point of view, the president was out of control. Though long regarded as a conservative anti-communist, Nixon had actually developed a worldview that favored diplomacy and arms control over confrontation and a continued arms race. And this image that we see right here, this is the handshake for around the world. This is Nixon arriving in Beijing, and the moment he steps off of those carpeted steps right there, his right hand was jutted out to grab hold of Zhou Enlai's hand. And why this is important, because I'm going to roll back the clock to Geneva, 1954, when then Secretary of State, I can't think of Dulles, I can't think of it, John Foster Dulles, our Secretary of State, who'd been the 900-pound gorilla in Geneva, refused to shake hands with either Zhou Enlai or with the negotiators for the Viet Minh at that time. And it was a huge contretemps. Nixon tried to heal that by stepping off of that plane in Beijing and shaking hands with Zhou Enlai. That's what we see right there. Now, Nixon needed to control his political destiny and to prevent the blunting of this agenda that he came into office with by bureaucrats, pushed him toward the establishment of what was, in effect, a secret government that he was going to run through the NSC. Through Kissinger, Nixon set up a back channel through which he and the National Security Advisor, what NSA stands for there, they could transmit private messages within the government and abroad. They were using special codes, teletypes, secure terminals located in the Pentagon and in the White House Situation Room. And through this, the president and his NSC staff could send and receive messages to selected American officials and members of foreign governments. And the key word there is selected. He just wanted a handful of people to know. Now, while the Pentagon was aware of this back channel, because they're the ones that had set it up, especially in regard to the secret war in Southeast Asia, of which they approved, they feared that it kept them uninformed of other activities, and they didn't like it. The Pentagon itself saw itself being cut out, ignored, circumvented on all the other important issues, meaning the conduct of the war, troop withdrawals, peace negotiations, and strategic arms limitation treaty. We will refer to it as SALT. Now, the chaos I'll refer to here, they intended on Kissinger's effort to control foreign policy, essentially keeping it away from the State Department, keeping it away from the Pentagon, and expand this little NSC empire, gave the spy ring breathing room at its birth. I love this photograph that I've chosen here of Kissinger. He's thinking he's getting around the Pentagon, and the Pentagon has found a way around him. So during this Kissinger-led expansion, Robinson managed to establish himself and Bradford in an office, a small office in the EOB, that's the Executive Office Building right across from the White House, in which Robinson was able to remove all of the civilian employees. And Radford was able to make friends with these departing civilians who he was replacing, because just like Dennis Weaver, just like Chester, he had a gift for disarming people and collecting information, traits that served him well as Robinson's aide. Yeoman Radford was the straight arrow. He was the espionage controller's dream. He was a barely noticed secretary who traveled easily through the NSC staff offices. He knew all the secretaries, what their schedules were. He was a tall, likable guy. Now, it wasn't long before he was converted from a passive to an active spy, and he began to steal information, not just pick up hints here and there. He began taking documents from burn bags, and I'm talking thousands of documents. And he began making copies in the oops, somebody's got a pup there. Began making
All right, the mute button's not muting. Let me see. Okay, I got
no.
it, I think.
He was making extra copies in the reproduction center. And this is a wonderful photograph from the 1970s that I found. This is the big assist to spy operations. No, not that slender woman in the pants or in the vest right there, but that Xerox machine. That was the spy master's biggest friend. You could just take a handful of documents and you can run off copies and return the originals, and nobody knew what you were doing. Somebody got the boot. Anyway, from late 70 to late 71, Radford literally collected thousands of documents from the White House, and while on foreign trips, documents that ranged from private messages between Nixon and Kissinger that involved the secret China gambit, to negotiating stances over sensitive European military bases, to closely guarded secret papers put together by Kissinger's NSC staff, to Nixon's strategy and timetable, because he had a timetable for withdrawing US troops from Southeast Asia. And Radford earned great praise from his admiral. And when Robinson was replaced by Admiral Robert Welander, praise for Radford became fainter, but the job was still there to be done. So we're going to shift from Robinson to Welander here in our discussion. So I'm going to come back to Welander in a moment, but before I do, I want to introduce the plumbers. Now,
can I ask a question?
oh, go right ahead. Go
Why
ahead,
did they replace him if he was doing such a good job?
He had wanted to get back in doing, get a sea command. See, all these naval guys, you know, they come into Washington for a while, but they really hunger for a sea command because it helps move them up through the promotion ladder. Now, as an admiral, he's pretty high, but he wants to get back to sea. So that's what he will do. And they're going to pull Robinson in from sea duty to working in Washington. And Robinson's sea duty is actually, Wellander's sea duty that he had been on is very interesting, but I'll get to that in a moment. Anything else, Margaret? Okay. So let's talk about the plumbers here for a moment. You know, finding a leak. And we back up just a little bit. In July of 1971, following the unauthorized release of Defense Department documents, later known as the Pentagon Papers, Nixon, through Ehrlichman, established the SIU, or the Special Investigative Unit. And they had a basement office. And when one of them had a relative, an older relative, said, "What's your job?" And they said, "Well, casually, well, we're just there to stop leaks." "Oh, you're like a plumber." And they thought that was humorous, so they made a little sign and they put it outside their office door. So it became a nom de plume that they gave themselves. Well, the SIU was staffed by two Kissinger proteges. David Young, seen up here in the upper right, and Eagle Crow Jr. in the lower left. Now, they had other jobs, but they were suddenly given this new task in the White House. And as I note here, they worked in an office in the EOB, and ostensibly their task was to identify and plug leaks. Here's the big secret. They were also assigned to create leaks. Not quite what we think about plumbers, is it? For example, Nixon wanted to leak information out of the Pentagon Papers about JFK that would be damaging to the assassinated president's legacy. He used to complain, what we need is to have a Daniel Ellsberg of our own who knows that work backwards and forwards and can, get those juicy nuggets out about Kennedy and we can leak them to the press. Yeah, that was Nixon. Anyway, Young and Crow, they'd work closely with Mr. Eyebrows here, Alexander Haig. Now, he had come into the White House as a colonel, but he's going to find the White House fertile ground for climbing the promotion ladder. And he served initially as a deputy to Kissinger when the Pentagon Papers first made headlines, again, the summer of '71. Well, as well, they worked with Haig when a story broke in the New York Times about the SALT talk. So they were on duty to identify when a leak happened, where did it come from? And how do we stop it? And how do we punish the leaker? Therefore, and this is a big leak, when a story employing White House and Defense Department documents appeared in the Washington Post on December '71 by none other than Jack Anderson, who had really great credentials, disclosing a tilt toward Pakistan in the South Asian border war with India, the administration became unglued. Now, of course, you're going to ask yourself, hey, when did it, like so many things go down the memory hole? Yeah, once upon a time, India and Pakistan were about to go at it. And the US ostensibly was neutral, but we were anything but neutral. Because Pakistan was giving us the entree into China, we were tilting toward Pakistan. And as a consequence, Soviet Union was lending their effort toward India. And here comes a big, juicy article in the paper with all the government documents to support this tilt toward Pakistan, in defiance of all the State Department people saying, we don't know anything about that. There is no tilt. We're neutral. One of the documents that Jack Anderson had been employing here was a memo on ship movements written just days before, and it was authored by none other than Admiral Wellender. That don't look so good, does it? The document disclosed that on December 10th, without any consultation with Defense Secretary Melvin Laird, who was really just putting a face on the Pentagon, and any other senior Navy commanders, Nixon had sent the Enterprise and 9 accompanying warships filled with 2,000 Marines into the Bay of Bengal to support Pakistan. Surprise, surprise. Well, Wellender, seeking to avoid responsibility, called up his friend Haig at the White House, and without ever having spoken to his cohort, Radford, rushed to accuse him of the leak. Haig then turned to Ehrlichman, who turned upon his 2 crime busters here, Young and Crow, to investigate. They were jumping on this thing within days. Young and Crow turned to a top civilian investigator within the Pentagon. This gentleman we see here, Don Stewart, former FBI. As I note, his honesty often rankled high-ranking military officers and senior bureaucrats. They don't really like honest people. Anyway, he was reporting to the Defense Department's General Counsel, J. Fred Buzzard. And we're going to hear a lot more about Fred Buzzard as we move through this story. But right now, I just want to introduce Don Stewart, who's one of the good guys. Anyway, Stewart assembled a team to investigate the Anderson column, and joining Young and Crow, Stewart questioned all the officers and enlisted men assigned to offices in which the Admiral Moore had worked. And based on Wellander's assertion, Radford soon came up as the prime suspect. He was the prime suspect not only because Wellander said he was, but Radford had been stationed in India, as you'll remember, and he had some social contact with Jack Anderson's parents when they were touring that nation. It's so casual. I'll get into it later. But 2 days after the Anderson column was published, Radford was summoned to the Pentagon for an interrogation by Stewart. So we can see everyone that's going to be in the room there. There's the yeoman, there's Young in the upper left, and in the lower right, there's Stewart. They're going to grill him. Radford was strapped to a lie detector, but he did so willingly because he believed he would pass with flying colors. He thought the whole questioning was about his social relationship with Jack Anderson. But what Radford did not consider was that an ancillary question would uncover the extent to which he had been spying for the JCS. Have you ever furnished classified documents to uncleared persons? And of course, that little graph just went. Months earlier, Radford had begun rationalizing his action. I'm doing this because, my commander has asked me to, and he needs it. But over time, he'd become doubtful. As I said, he was stealing documents right and left. And with this question, have you ever furnished classified documents to unclear persons? He was stuck. And guess what? He answered yes. He was, however, unwilling to disclose further information until he spoke with his superior, Admiral Wellander, the person who just got through throwing him under the bus. The stage was now set for one of those small misinterpretations of information on which great events sometimes hinge. David Young called Wellander and said, "Hey, your boy Radford over here has admitted to everything, but he won't go beyond a certain point without talking to you." But Wellander is presuming that the disclosure has to do with the personal relationship with Jack Anderson, not with the secret spy op. So Radford was handed the phone. "Admiral, they're asking me all about our job at the Pentagon. What should I do?" "Chuck, all you can do is tell the truth." Well, during the interrogation that followed, Radford broke down into tears. He stated that the theft of these documents were contrary to his religious faith. Radford was a Mormon, and he hoped to obtain absolution through prayer. And when Radford finished, he was so drained he could hardly walk. Stewart was shocked by the story. "This is a goddamn 7 days in May. We've got the military spying on the president." This guy saw it exactly for what it was. But Wellander, when news began to spread over the Pentagon, he realized that he made a mistake in advising Radford to talk. And the next day, he tried to stop Stewart from further questioning of the yeoman. But it was too late. The facts were out. Wellender himself admitted to receiving the bootleg documents. Radford believed that stealing from the White House was made necessary by decisions on the part of Nixon and Kissinger to withhold this vital information from the JCS. The military had to intervene because if they hadn't, I'm afraid of what would have happened. Isn't that always the case? All right, let's take it. This is a good time to take a break right here. Let me see if there's any questions that any of you have about this information about the the Moore-Radford spy scam, because it's just been broken open. It's been operating for 16 months, and it just got broke open. And we're going to go deeper into the confession here, but let's see if you'd like to question anything about it.
Do you have a question?
Go ahead. Yeah, you know, or if you need to step away for a few minutes, you know, or just comment on anything. It's all good. You know, and this whole thing, and we're going to see that this whole thing will be buried. I'm getting a little bit ahead of the story here. Again, I'm going to get ahead of the story. I don't want to do that just yet. So let me just keep any questions or comments just about this young yeoman, Radford, and his willingness to serve his master because he believed he was doing the right thing. Bless you. Sneezes always come for me, sneezes always come in threes.
They do.
And
she has a view of her system.
I don't know if there's actually I should probably also go down here and see if I can pull up anything in the chat right here. I don't see anything.
Not the type of person who should be owning a gun. So there were all sorts of these red flags that were there. And so now all sorts of questions in terms of why someone like this was a candidate to have this sort of clearance to have access to classified information.
Hold on. Is someone asking a question? I'm getting a lot of feedback. So ask the question again, if you will. Anything? And I don't see any comments in the chat, so I don't see anything there. All right, well, let's move on. Let's move on. I know I didn't take as long as I said I would. This new section is an admiral confesses. Now, as I may have mentioned before, I was raised Catholic, and when you're raised Catholic, you know, you're taught about, you know, when you have the sacrament of confession, it has to be done with contrition. You have to really mean you're sorry and do something about it. And as I'm going to say here, we're going to have an admiral making a confession, but it's going to be without contrition. So it's not going to go very far. Nixon learned of the spy operation within days. And this whole thing broke wide open within a matter of a couple of days here. And he was informed about it after he's returning from vacation in Key Biscayne. And of course, he had a short stop in New York for a dinner and a show. You know, I may have mentioned this in the past. Nixon and Pat loved musical theater. And that's how they met. They actually met at Whittier College performing on the stage. And after the '62 gubernatorial election in California here, which he lost, he went to New York and he worked in a law office, which is where he met John Mitchell. And he had a wonderful experience living in New York because he had complete access to all those Broadway shows. And he and Pat and the girls would go out on a weekly basis to see all the new musicals. And he loved it. Can you imagine this? I want you to get this picture in your mind. Nixon would come into work humming and singing tunes from the Broadway musicals that he had just seen. He loved them. He would have been a different person. He stayed in New York.
Yes.
Anyway, he comes back to DC and he receives the details from the Radford espionage in a meeting with Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and Mitchell on December 21st, 71. I couldn't find a picture, all the same people there, except I had to switch out a picture that had J. Edgar Hoover in it rather than Haldeman. Well, the president's response on learning this was cautious. You recognize that Radford's admissions were bombshells that had to be carefully handled. His concern was whether further investigation of this military espionage would expose the super sensitive back channel that he and Kissinger had set up with the aid of Moore. Nixon decreed that Welander should be questioned to see if he could corroborate Radford's story. Now I'm going to add a little side note right here. Mitchell, as I said, was in on this meeting, and he had the best response of all. He said, first thing you got to do is shut down that liaison office. You got to get that admiral in here. You got to knock his head around, and then him and this yeoman, they've got to be sent to the most furthest reaches possible. They are out of DC from this point on. But Nixon didn't listen to Mitchell. Following day, Ehrlichman summoned the admiral from the Pentagon to his office on the 3rd floor of the West Wing. And Welander arrived to find Ehrlichman, Young, and a microphone leading to a tape recorder with a large spool of tape. So as you'll begin to see, tape recorders and tapes play a big part in this story. Now, initially, Ehrlichman handed Welander a document that was drafted by Young based on Radford's confessions from the day before. And Ehrlichman asked the admiral to read the document, correct any inaccuracies, and then please sign it. Welander read the document, but he refused to sign. These are totally false charges of political spying. Not me, baby. His initial refusal to sign the statement proved only a prelude to a confession that would last more than an hour and was much more detailed than the admissions on the statement. Sometimes we should quit while we're ahead. And that's the case of Admiral Welander, as we will soon see. Ehrlichman began questioning. He carefully asked the admiral if it'd be okay if he turned on the recorder. And Welander said, well, okay. So the tape starts rolling. There's nobody between me and Admiral Moore. I give him exactly what he needs to act as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Welander goes on to describe how when he came to the liaison position, he had been apprenticed by Admiral Robinson, who taught him how to do the job. Robinson would trade a piece of information about the Pentagon to a civilian NSC aide in exchange for a piece from within that organization. It was a give and take, a tit for tat. He noted that there was a conscious decision on the part of Admiral Moore, seen here in our photograph, to sacrifice certain privileged Pentagon information in order to obtain more valuable talking papers from the NSC, which they weren't getting. NSC staffers came to me with all kinds of requests all the time, and I felt I was giving up more to them than I was getting. Well, amid the confusion of the NSC staff, Wellender thought that it was only Admiral Alexander Haig here who understood the role completely. Haig was playing both sides of the street. He reported to Haig virtually every day, and he forged a close relationship with him. It was Haig who had pressed him to provide Radford for the Kissinger trip to Vietnam. Instead of taking along a female secretary, take along Radford. You know, he can carry the suitcases as well as take dictation. And he as well can pilfer all the burn bags and go into everybody's attaché cases. That's why they sent Radford with Haig to Vietnam. Ehrlichman prodded Wellender as to Moore's knowledge of Radford's activities. He admitted to Ehrlichman and Young that he had given instructions to Radford before he traveled with Haig to Vietnam. He told Radford that the JCS were concerned about the troop withdrawal rate. Wellender confirmed that Moore had learned of Kissinger's secret peace talks with Le Duc Tho. And learning that Kissinger was talking secretly with the enemy, it could only have increased the JCS's anxiety that the civilians are making deals with the enemy while the American soldiers died in the jungle. And this is the root of the matter right there. This is why they thought Nixon was a traitor, why they thought Kissinger was a traitor, because he's over there talking to the enemy while our service people are dying in Vietnam. Throughout this confession, one thing became clear to Young, and that is his crucial role that Alexander Haig played in the spy game. Haig conveyed information from the JCS to the NSC and from the White House to the Pentagon. Haig was playing, as I said, both sides of the street. Haig's loyalty was principally to the military establishment that had brought him to this position of power within the NSC. Now, all these people take an oath, to support and defend the Constitution. those are hollow words, baby. They support the service or the agency of which they are part. I love this. After all, the West Point motto is duty first, and then honor, and country drags in at third place. Young had wondered, could Haig not have been cognizant of Radford's activities? Well, when Ehrlichman and Young concluded their interview with Wellender, the Admiral returned to the Pentagon and he told his boss what had just happened. Ehrlichman had the interview transcribed in preparation to see the president about the matter. He remembered thinking at the time, boy, this is bigger than even I thought. Here comes the full disclosure. Now we remember a phrase from the Watergate Committee under Sam Ervin, the phrase voiced by Senator Howard Baker. What did the president know? And when did he know it? Well, it applies right here. Less than 2 hours after they had Wellender's taped confession, Ehrlichman and Young sat in Nixon's office and the EOB, Mitchell and Haldeman, they're right alongside the president, and they break it down for him. Ehrlichman laid out the story as he and Young heard it from the Admiral. And Ehrlichman is thinking, let's go. Let's have a thorough investigation. And make this real. But Nixon did not ask to hear the taped interview or to read the transcript when it became available, because his mind was already made up about what he wanted to do. And here it comes. He was convinced that the matter of utmost importance was his re-election. He was convinced that what would recommend him to the electorate for re-election were his foreign policy triumphs. And here they are. He's got a visit to Beijing scheduled the following month, February 72. He's got a summit in Moscow later that spring, at which he's going to be signing the SALT and the ABM treaties, which he's trying to push through. And he's also hoping that the secret talks in Paris with Les Ducteaux would bear some fruit. In Nixon's mind, these triumphs depended on the back-channel communications enabled by the JCS, and specifically the Navy. If this spy operation and the back-channel were to become known, it would publicly reveal how Defense Secretary Melvin Laird had been repeatedly circumvented, which is why Melvin Laird was put into that role to begin with. He could always, if he was ever called up to Congress, he could say, I don't know anything, because he didn't know anything. And the same with Rogers and State Department. That's why Nixon kept them in the dark, so they could honestly say, I don't know. But if Laird found out that this whole thing was going on, you better believe he was going to put a tight rope around every one of those military officers, and he'd never let it happen again. So, at that meeting, Nixon decided to bury the spying operation. Cover it up, if you will. So long before we have break-in at Democratic Party and Nixon's response to it, we're watching how the president says, we got to bury this, we got to cover it up. Nixon did not want it known that he'd been spied upon by the military. He didn't want it known that there was any daylight between him and them, because it would undermine his image as a strong leader. Furthermore, he decided not to fire Moore as head of JCS. He's going to reappoint him. He's thinking, this will keep him compliant. As for the other culprits, Wellender would be given a C command, send him out of Washington, but before leaving, the JCS office would be closed. This is the only thing that Nixon followed on that Mitchell had given him guidance on. Shut that office down now. And the files were passed over to Haig and then to Ehrlichman. Radford, he was sent to East Jesus Naval Training Center in Oregon. I note here that he would not realize his ambition of becoming an officer, but in fact, he will. He will become a chief petty officer much later, though. But none of these people were brought up before a court-martial, which is what they should have happened with them. But check this out. Robinson would be brought back from his C command to Washington for his interview. But before doing so, he made a little side trip to the Pentagon, and he received a briefing by the Defense Department's General Counsel, Fred Buzzard. And as a result of this preparation, like we hear in court all the time, he got lawyered up. Robinson was less forthcoming in his interview and more adept at avoiding culpability because he got all lawyered up over at the Pentagon by Buzzard. Finally, in managing the scandal, Nixon wanted to limit Kissinger's awareness of it. In particular, Nixon directed that Kissinger's aide, Alexander Haig, should be protected. And he's as thick as thieves with these other guys. Despite the connection to the scandal, Nixon did not want Haig blamed. And of course, it begs the question, why? He liked Haig. He liked Haig's decisive manner. As I noted, Haig came to the White House as a colonel, and within a year, he jumped to brigadier general. He got his first star, and by 72, he got his second star. Now he's major general. This guy's moving on up, huh? During the early part of his tenure, this is key, Haig had been an operations officer of a wiretapping program that had been implemented by FBI at the direction of the president. And this was done without any warrants. Nixon was thinking, well, it's all those guys on Kissinger's staff who are leaking things, and I want to find out who it is. So they put taps on all their telephones, both in the office and at home. It was aimed at finding whether any of them were leaking to the press. Because in an effort to bring his peace plan in Southeast Asia, Nixon had been carrying out a bombing campaign in Laos and Cambodia, and somebody spilled the beans on that. And it showed up in the newspaper. And he became unglued, and he wanted to find who the culprit was. But guess what? With this unwarranted wiretapping on all the NSC staff, no leakers were ever discovered, and all of the staff knew that their phones were being tapped. And they felt that all of this surveillance was just openly political against them. And eventually these taps were discontinued. But Haig is the one overseeing this whole unwarranted wiretapping of the NSC staff. By January of '72, the Moore-Radford scandal was effectively buried, and Nixon's suspicion subsided. He had other things on his mind. Turned his attention to the upcoming China trip, and after that was coming to the Soviet Union. As I like to say, before that happened, something odd occurred. Yes, back to the Pentagon and J. Fred Buzzard, the counsel who had prepared Robinson for his interview. He had asked to have his own interview with Admiral Wellender. He said, this is at the request of the president. And what we'll see frequently in this long journey that we're taking down the river is these guys saying, I'm doing this at the request of the president. But really, they're carrying out their own agenda. Nixon didn't know anything about a re-interview of Wellender. The interview of Wellender, I should say, the re-interview of Wellender was conducted with Dawn Stewart, the SIU investigator who exposed the spy ring. But Buzzard didn't tell Stewart that Wellender had already confessed in an interview with Ehrlichman and Young. Now, the interview was similar to the early confession with one big, fat exception. All references to Alexander Haig's complicity were all but avoided. They wanted to clean the record on this gentleman right here. Oh, and one more thing before we leave the topic. In August of 1969, a young Navy lieutenant came to Washington. It sounds like a script for a musical. The young lieutenant comes to Washington, and this is after 4 years of sea duty. Now, this officer, he was a lieutenant. He was serving on the USS Fox, which was a communication vessel. And guess who had been the commanding officer of the USS Fox during that time? Yes, none other than Admiral Wellender. So Admiral Wellender and this young Navy lieutenant had some experience, and both of them are in Washington right now. And this wonderful image that I show here really gives the glimpse of how Washington looked to all these people. It's chaos out there. We've got people trying to overthrow the government, by ending poverty and ending the war. Well, ostensibly, the Navy brought this young lieutenant to the Pentagon as a communications watch officer. And there he was charged with overseeing 30 sailors who manned terminals, teletypes, classified coding machines. So this guy had the highest secret clearance you could get in the Navy because he's overseeing everybody else. And this sensitive position afforded the young lieutenant access to top secret communication channels through which the Navy sent its most secure messages. And it was through one of these secure channels that the president had been conducting his highly sensitive foreign policy, his back channel around state and defense. In addition to being one of the officers charged with managing this communication center, this young lieutenant had another job. He was specially selected to be a briefer. Now, a briefer is an officer who sees, hears, reads, and assimilates information from one or a variety of sources, and then conveys it succinctly and intelligently to more senior officers. So this young lieutenant was often sent across the river from the Pentagon to the basement of the White House, where he would enter the offices of the NSC. And there he would act as a briefer to none other than Alexander Haig. And he was also a briefer to Admiral Moore. This Navy lieutenant was none other than Bob Woodward, who we will discover will play a big role in the Watergate story in just a few months. And with that, I think that's enough. Oh, I have an afterword. I'm just like a television show. It never ends. There's always one more piece. If it wasn't Yeoman Radford, who did leak to Jack Anderson? Well, as it turned out, the source for the Jack Anderson columns was an Army enlisted man, a communications specialist named Stephen Linger, who had worked at the Digital Information Relay Center, a room through which Moore provided the back channel to Kissinger and Nixon. So it's all on the same network there. They just picked up the wrong guy. Linger insisted that he never gave Anderson anything that threatened the lives of U.S. servicemen, and he never turned over top secret documents. He had, however, given important materials to the columnist because he had become disillusioned with the Pentagon and the conduct of the Vietnam War. That sound familiar to anybody? Does it ring a bell with any of the recent service people who have disclosed information? So it's nothing new. We often have service people who become disenchanted with the direction our nation is going in. Here was a statement of Stephen Linger. I saw the government was doing things that were very wrong, and in my small way, I tried to do something about it. And that will conclude Spies Like Us. It's all about spies.
The deep state is alive and well.
Let me stop the share here. And we'll get into get my cursor over that. Hunt around here for it. Come on. There we go. All right, everyone. I'm back with you. You know, it's just a fascinating story of all this intrigue going on. And it's because Nixon was keeping things private from the military. And they don't like that. And so they found a way inside the White House. So that's not it. So what you got for me? Go ahead, Margaret.
After hearing this, all I can say is the more things change, the more they stay the same. I mean, it's like you think our government today is crazy. This is just, I mean, this just sounds just nuts to me. And I remember, I mean, I lived through this whole era, and I was thinking about it in terms of, well, the past was not so tumultuous as it is today in the present with our government, but I'm wrong. I mean, wow.
And baby, we've just started down this path. The stuff that's coming up in the future episode that I'm going to reveal to you, it's amazing. But it really is, like you say, we think that we're living in a time of confusion. It's always been this way. And if we just look back and we open a book and read, it all exposes itself. It's just that's why reading is a dangerous thing, because you're liable to change your mind.
I think I'm moving to a farm in Idaho on 50 acres, and I'm going to start my own little country.
Margaret, that's what we all thought in the 70s. And look
That's
where we're
true.
at.
I was going to say, having lived through Vietnam and, you know, that whole era, and having my husband away, it's like, it's like, oh my goodness, this is, the whole world is just kind of nuts, and always has been, I guess.
You know, and from the military standpoint, they thought the president and especially Kissinger were acting as traitors because they were acting in violation of the chain of command, which they viewed as unconstitutional. So their responses to spy on him, they didn't view as treasonous. It was something they needed to do to protect the country. We've got an executive in power that is going around the norms, and we have to do something to protect our nation. That's what's in their minds.
Williams back to DC.
It is.
Well, that should be in our minds now, too.
Oh, go further. Go further with that.
Hey, John, real quick question for you.
Sure.
How much are you going to go into Woodward's role in a lot of this? Because
I'm going to go deeply into it, but it'll have to be in part 2 because that's where he really shows up. You know, I'll introduce him, you know, in episode 4 of this, where he is beginning to write articles that show up in the Post about the arrest of the 5 burglars. But where he really makes his presence known is in those 6 months afterwards with the articles that are showing up in the Post at that time, and then the disclosure of the source that he refers to as Deep Throat. I'm going to talk a lot about Deep Throat and that, but that'll have to be in part 2, if that's okay. But I want to at least introduce him now.
Right. Do you go into his Navy time while he was still in the service between 70 and 72, what he was doing at that point in time?
He was serving aboard this vessel. I should probably show a picture of it, the USS Fox, because he was an intelligence officer and a communications officer aboard that vessel. And he gets land duty in Washington to serve as this communications officer in this highly sensitive area. So this guy is so deeply woven into the system.
Right.
And of course, he denies every bit of it. He denies it all.
Yeah.
And yet, you know, he says, you know, the authors of the main source work here Len Kolodny and Gitlin, they challenged him on this. And he said, you go out and find someone who says that I did this. Well, they went out and they found Admiral Moore. And he said, yeah, he did serve in that position and he was my briefer. So you're not going to get any better source than Admiral Moore himself.
No, no. You were gonna say something. You were gonna say something.
Well, it is an interesting conflict, as it always is in terms of supposedly the government's set up with checks and balances, and one group is checking the other, that's checking the other, that's checking the other. And it just gets very confusing, and if one group says that this is the right way to do it and you should be following this, then they make things happen to change the course of events. It's just, I don't know how you ever get rid of all of that gobbledygook.
You know, we struggle through. We struggle through. Well, the best we can say, you know, but it helps us to understand what, you know, or appreciate what's going on today, or what was going on 10 years ago or 20 years ago, to look back as we've done, you know, 60 years ago with Kennedy, or now 50 years ago with Nixon, and look deep into these administrations and have a better idea of what was going on and how things were going on.
Unfortunately, it takes 50 years.
It does. Yes,
And life has changed accordingly. And that regretfully, it takes so long to find these things out.
Yeah. You know, and this, as I said, the astonishing thing to me is this information that I'm presenting you has been available, and particularly the information that I'll share with you next week that largely is coming up from Jim Hogan. That's been around for 40 years. The information from Len Kolodny and Gitlin, that's been available for 30 years. And how little of it has penetrated the consciousness or the willingness to express it of the media or academics or politicians to say, oh yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Well, and the other part of that is that when you have a force like the Washington Post, that is the large purveyor of this information, and again, the media, and I was a journalist, so I really is disheartening. You want to believe these major papers and the media are telling you the truth. And
they're telling you the side of the story that they want us to hear, that
Right.
best reflects on them, and they spike anything that contravenes it.
and they make major decisions for all of us mentally, and we don't even know it.
Do you think these people were all just, I mean, it seems like all the leaders of the country from way back to current are all just inherently dishonest, or do you think that they just at the time think they're doing what's right?
No, Penny, it's a really good question. They think they're doing the right thing. Now they're justifying it to themselves. Now Nixon, when he comes into, you know, he has a fully formed foreign policy that he wants to carry out. Kissinger is going to implement it, but he's worked it out. He says, we've got to end this Cold War. And to do that, I've got to make a deal with the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union, I can't get them off the dime. And then he learns through Pakistan that China wants a rapprochement. So he works through Pakistan to get to Beijing. And when the Soviet Union learns about that, now they're willing to make a movement on détente. So Nixon gets both of his prizes with this action. But to do it, he's got to go around he thinks he has to go around the establishment. And the other part of this, of course, is his policy in Southeast Asia. He's engaged in this massive bombing campaign, illegal, by attacking Cambodia and Laos, and that, of course, that becomes discovered, and he's starting to withdraw American combat troops from Vietnam and having them replaced by South Vietnamese troops. And of course, he knows where that's going to go. Everybody's going to say, oh, yeah, that country can stand on its own. Everybody knows that once U.S. combat troops are out, it's going to collapse. And what Kissinger is over there in Paris negotiating for is a decent interval. Give us 12 to 18 months before you come into Saigon. And what happened? We got 12 to 18 months before they came into Saigon. And the military leaders know this, and they see it coming, and the president being honest with them. So they feel justified in doing what they're doing. We've got to know what he's doing. He's not telling us.
Interesting.
Go ahead. Is that, Kathleen, your hand raised there, baby? Or you just-
Yeah. I don't know whether I needed to push button or something.
In this
No,
room,
it's
this room,
it's
you can
also
talk up.
convoluted. Pardon?
in this room, you can just speak up.
It's
baby.
just so convoluted.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. I was raised in Maryland, Baltimore County. So all this stuff was local news.
Yeah.
It's all I can, I start listening to this and you knew at the time it smelled bad. And there are so many characters and there are so many people thrown under the bus. And then you start looking forward to what's going on now. And we didn't learn anything.
Well, or perhaps we learned too well. We learned too well because this.
Oh, well, I guess you could put it that way. I mean, because we didn't, we look at history from a long lens now, and it's still repeating. As
Kathleen, I tell you.
the pub.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Not good. You're about to say
No, go.
Well, when we get, thank you for sharing the fact that you had a long history in Maryland and particularly Baltimore County, because particularly the next episodes, when we are really dealing with what's going on in DC with the civilians there, and what was happening with the DNC, it's going to be so familiar to you, but you're going to learn what really was happening, not what was recorded that was happening.
Yeah, which is why I was really attracted to doing this Zoom, because it's just, on one level, good.
So you finish your statement. I keep cutting you off.
No, it's just like, on one level that it's what's going on is just absurd. But you almost need a wall to do a timeline on, and all the diagrams of who's connected to who else and why. And it's just all so familiar what's going on now. The names have been changed. That's it.
I encourage. The problem is the information you're learning in this course here. Nobody else is. You're not going to get it from anybody else, and so you're going to want to. You're going to want to talk to somebody about this.
I don't have anyone to talk about. I'm in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I have lost friends. And you just, after a while, you just shut up because nobody wants to hear it. Yeah.
The interesting, Kathleen, if I could just comment, the interesting thing to me that you said was about history. I think today the young people have no idea about the history of anything that went on. Therefore, and they don't seem to care about politics today. I have a business partner that I loved that I can no longer talk to because of what's going on today. It's true. You know, you
Well,
just can't.
look at what they started doing a couple of 3-4 years ago with destroying monuments and destroying. They're systematically trying to erase our history. They're not teaching it.
Mhm.
Look at what they're doing to the kids in elementary school. It's just like, it's mind-boggling. I start talking about this stuff and it's like pulling a piece of spaghetti out of a pile. I mean, it's just like there's more. It's like drinking out of a fire hose sometimes.
All right, everyone, if we have to
Yeah.
close out here. Kathleen,
Yeah.
we'll pick this up next week. Thank you for mentioning it.
Wait a
We're
minute.
at the end of our time right here. Oh, did you have a question? Bob?
Okay.
One question for Kathleen. What part of Baltimore County are you from?
Upper Baltimore County,
Upper
Towson.
Towson?
Does
Okay.
that mean?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Looks like you got a
Right.
few.
Horse country.
We're from Maryland.
Upper
We're
Baltimore
from Maryland.
County.
I was born there.
Oh, we're really
All
cool.
right, you guys, so you will
See you
always,
next time,
you
maybe.
will always be safe in this room here.
Yeah.
Yep.
A safe room.
All right, everyone.
Good class. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
See
you.
ya.
Good class.
Thank you. All right.
Bye. Thank you.
And Sandra, thank you. We both can close out. the-
Thanks, John.